Perfect.
Well, it's all yours.
Okay, cool. Actually, if you'll hit the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to build off of the examples that Benjamin just showed and give you a feel for how you might investigate some domain infringement examples if that is something you're seeing in your organization. But before we kick it off, I wanted to just give a brief overview of what the I3 team is. We keep using the term I3. It stands for Incident Investigation and Intelligence, and we represent the managed services component at RiskIQ. We have many decades of expertise in both cyber and physical security, and then we are able to essentially leverage all that expertise to apply additional analysis and intelligence on top of the whole suite of RiskIQ products. And what we're going to be talking about today actually shows that perfectly. We're going to talk about domain infringement, which the I3 team manages the external threats platform, and that's one of the modules that we track through external threats. And then we're also going to show I3 can do an additional investigation on top of that information to give you some more context and background behind a domain infringement instance. So with that, I think advance to the next slide, and I will turn this over to Josh.
Howdy, howdy. All right, so with this, we're going to be checking out when you see a domain infringement event, what it really is and how it's going to be affecting you. So a lot of times you might come across a domain that is typo squatted, which means they're going to just change the URL just a little bit. So like with linkedin.com, what we were looking at before, you might see something where, it's LinkedIn with 2 I's. So they're just changing something little to mislead a potential customer or client and harm your business. You can also see ones that are just purely registered malicious from the beginning, where they might say, if we're doing LinkedIn example, it'd be LinkedIn signin.com or something. So they're actually using your brand or client's name in the domain itself, and they registered this 100% maliciously to impersonate or apply affiliation with you. Some of the issues that this can cause is, as stated just a minute ago, is it can cause damage to your brand and reputation, because people are going to be going to these sites thinking that you are affiliated with them or that you own them, and that's not the case. So they can put anything they want on there, redirect you to anywhere they want to their content or any sort of malicious content. It can put your customers' data in jeopardy, as they can take the credentials from your site, take credentials from other companies as well, just by going that and using spear phishing, because if they're using something as a typo squat or using a malicious domain, they can send out emails with that final domain. So it might say, hr@linkedinsignin.com, and your customers are going to believe that that's a legitimate email. And that also opens up the door to the business email compromises, as they can keep digging in and go against your own infrastructure to gather information to harm the business and potential customers.
Yeah, and one thing I want to mention is, like, the LinkedIn example that I showed you is a good example where somebody can steal the LinkedIn credentials, and you go, oh, it's just LinkedIn credentials. Who cares? But now they have your contact in Rolodex, where they can now target people in your organization or friends or colleagues or affiliates or partners with these targeted campaigns.
Yeah, a lot of times it's just the tip of the iceberg when you're seeing it. So it's always good to be addressing this kind of stuff. As for what you can do, when you originally are coming across it, it's always a good idea just to shoot it out to Google to try to browser block it, whether that's just content itself or a malicious domain. They're usually pretty responsive with this. They'll do their own investigation and go from there. The next initial step that we usually advise somebody is to work with the registrant, because even though they are a threat actor, a lot of times if they get caught, they'll work with you just to get rid of it so they can clear their name, get done with it, move on to their next scam that they're going to do. But at least your company is safe at that point for that domain. But there are many cases where they won't work with you, because, as we just said, they're a threat actor, so they might not play nice. And then at that step, usually with a malicious domain, you're going to work with the registrar themselves You can find the registrar by using PT, figuring out the contact information for them, and just explain the situation to them. You're going to be telling them how it's a threat, what you needed, why you need it taken down, and oftentimes they'll work with you to put that in client hold status or get that transferred to you depending on what your final status that you want at that domain. In some cases, if there's not enough infringement on the domain, such as typo squats even, they can be a little 50-50 on. You can work with the hosting provider to try to get the content itself just removed or the IP nulled. Unfortunately, that does usually leave the domain in the threat actor's possession, so they are free to try to move around to another hosting provider, spin some other stuff up, but sometimes it kind of knocks them down where they'll kind of quit playing around. You can either try to purchase it or once again, just continue to work with the registrar so you can work in tandem with the two.
Is that sinkholing? And that would be an example. Would be sinkholing a domain?
Say one more time. It cut out.
Would that be sinkholing a domain?
Yeah. I mean, at the point with the hosting provider, they're not going to do anything outside of the content. So if we can say we're going to IP null it, if the registrar doesn't play nice with us, you're kind of stuck in moving on to the next steps for that. We've seen many threats come up where the hosting provider will take the content down, and then 2 weeks later they move to Amazon Web Services or something like that, and then they spin up a new content. So if it's a truly malicious domain, it's always good to try to just get the registrar to put it in client hold status and get that in your possession if possible. So if neither of those are working, if for some reason the registrar is not playing nice, if the hosting provider isn't taking action, another option is always to look at the new generic top-level domain registry owner or operator. Usually these are owned by companies that are pretty active in making sure that their top-level domains are only used for legitimate purposes. So if you reach out to them, they can shut it down. They'll document who's been using this so to prevent future infringement. But usually that's the last step because it's a little bit slower of a process. When you're registering with an entire TLD, they have a lot of complaints and a lot of issues to address. So if all those steps are failing, one of the final steps that you can pursue is going for DRP, so domain resolution policy. And that's when you're saying, okay, well, the registrar's not cooperating for some reason, the hosting provider's not. You can work with ICANN to try to get proceedings going to just get the domain turned over to you. It's usually a very lengthy process and it's not cheap, but it is usually successful if you have some sort of actual legal basis to say these guys are being malicious.
Wonderful. And Barrett, please let us know if any questions come up for Josh. Any specific questions?
Will do.
Okay.
Okay, so in addition to working to get the content, domain, or IP taken down, you can also investigate to see what you've got here. And oftentimes this is really important because you don't fully know the nature of the threat or the extent of the problem unless you do a little bit of digging into that. So the 3 points I really want to make here is when you're investigating, you want to look at the underlying infrastructure, then you want to look for patterns across similar domain infringement candidates. So if you are a company that's getting hundreds of typo squatted domains popping up all the time, how many of them are connected and might be by one threat actor? And then at the end, following the clues to attribution to understand who might be behind it and how to keep a lookout for this in the future. So next slide, please. The example I'm going to talk through today is one that we actually did for a client a few months back. So we're just going to refer to it as domain X, but the infrastructure we're going to talk about, we can actually pull it up live. So in the case of domain X, we started in passive total. We saw that it was created a few months ago. We knew it was email capable, which is a big flag that's concerning. And then it was only resolving to one IP address, this .153. So if folks want to actually take a look in passive total and pull this up for themselves,
I'm I'm going to grab it real quick for you, or you can paste it. So I have it right now. I had to kill the screen for 1 second so I can get that in here. So here's the link. I'm pasting into the chat. If you want to paste them in as well, you can, Jordan.
Awesome.
Because I'll have to kill the presentation to paste them in.
Yeah, no worries. I'm actually gonna, while folks are looking at this in PT, I am going to take over as presenter and just pull up my screen so we can walk through it real quick. So as you look through this, be thinking about some of the things that Benjamin showed us in the last few examples of what might be alarming as you look at this.
And we don't see your screen just yet.
Okay, how about now?
Yes.
Seeing PT? Okay, awesome. All right, one thing I also wanted to mention, because we are kind of suspending disbelief and we were investigating this a couple months back, our domain X is not currently a resolution, so you don't have to think that the single one you see today is what we're talking about, but I do want you to look at this IP as if this resolution was happening today, just to see kind of the state of play. So if folks want to add anything that they observe in the chat, please feel free. There's a lot to review here, but I'll start calling out some of the things that stood out to me as I started to look at this. First, we see that it is blacklisted, big red flag, and it's got lots and lots of domain resolutions, not so much as of today, but historically you can see there's many going on at a time. And then one other place that I drew my attention very quickly was the hashes tab. And I think Benjamin showed this might be something you need to enable in your settings to make sure that you're seeing this when you look through passive total to see some of these hashes, but they're very easy to copy and paste into VirusTotal. So I'm gonna just pop some in the chat in case folks aren't seeing it right now. So here's a couple. And if you move over to virustotal.com, which should also have been, I believe, one of the links that Benjamin included at the top, but you can go ahead and just put some of these hashes right in the search and see what comes back, just to get a sense. Obviously, we don't need to go through all 1,000, but just to get a sense of what we've got here. So quickly, we're starting to see, oh, lots of folks calling out Trojans here. That's good to know. We'll try another one. And we see the same thing as we include a couple more. In fact, I went through a good number of these and found almost all Trojans for the last few days at least. So that is, you know, all signs pointing towards this is bad. Anybody seen anything else they want to share? Okay, one other place that I recommend looking at is that OSINT tab. And we'll start to see right away, we've got things like IBM, we've got abuse IP. And if you pull those up, spoiler alert, you're gonna see more bad things. We've got abuse reports as of just a few days ago, hacking, fraud, spamming, scamming. And then IBM, you can see in the background, this was tagged for phishing. So we don't need to dig too much into this, but one other place I really like to find open source information on IPs is actually in Twitter. I think a lot of rogue researchers enjoy complaining about IP addresses in Twitter. So this is a place that I find a lot of good information, and it doesn't take much time. I just pasted the link in the chat if y'all want to follow along. But if you ever find an IP and you want to see if someone has put something out about it, of course, Google it, put it in quotes and give it a Google. That's going to pull back some of the big cybersecurity research that's out there. But folks on Twitter will just put it up, you know, without an additional thought. And so you might actually get more of a tip off if you check here. So I like to comb through here and just see, you know, what have people been talking about? So we've got people saying phishing coming from this IP. Oh, here's a report on this IP. And in this case, they actually notified the registrar, hey, this is related to you. This is super malicious. So, and that was last year. But if you kind of look through, looks like this has been known bad for quite some time, since 2016. So this is just a quick way to kind of get a feel for what you've got here. All right. I'm actually going to, Benjamin, give it back to you.
Okay.
Pull the slides back up.
Okay, I'll do it right now.
And then I think we can start on slide 59.
Okay.
Actually go one back, sorry about that.
Good.
Okay. All right, so you've now found that you've got some bad infrastructure. It's really important now to look across all of the domain infringement events that you might be tracking to see if that's tied to other things. So, you know, if you're a small company and you only get onesie twosies, this is pretty easy. But if you're dealing with large numbers, it becomes increasingly important to kind of group them to see if this is a campaign. So one thing I wanted to mention is that if you are trying to do this yourself, you could try a sort of like a DNS list. There's a GitHub link that we included at the beginning of the chat, and that's going to help generate some variant typo squatted domains that might be related to your brand. But this is also the sort of thing that external threats can do in a heartbeat and then continue to monitor. I believe DNS twist is something you have to proactively continue to refresh. So this might get outdated pretty quickly. But if you're, you know, just trying to get a feel for what's out there, that might actually help you. So from there, you want to keep track of these. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to manage all of your domains in PT so that you can pop them up at the drop of a hat and see what's changed very quickly. You can also leverage something like Maltego, which we talked about a little bit earlier. The community version is free, and I can't emphasize this enough. If you're trying to communicate with executives at your own company to kind of underscore what the problem or issue is, having a visual clutch. So highly recommend. And then of course you can leverage RiskIQ's external threats. This is something that we excel at. But just wanted to give you some of the options here if that's something you're trying to track. So tying this back to domain X, when we looked at that bad infrastructure, and then I looked across to see was this bad IP tied to anything else, it turns out it was actually being used by 11 other domain infringement candidates targeted against that brand. So pretty quickly we can get a sense for, you know, this is probably not a one-off, this is probably targeted, and that's something we need to keep track of. So now we can lump these together and say this is probably all a singular threat. Next slide, please. And then you want to keep digging into that infrastructure. When it was first created, domain X resolved to an Amazon IP address, and many of the same red flags presented as the one that we just searched. I found a ton of negative OSINT, connecting it to botnet and malware activity. So right off the bat, I'm thinking, uh-oh, this is probably also part of that. It was on the block list, and then go figure, an additional 10 domain infringement candidates on top of the 11 we found for the last one were tied to this second Amazon-owned IP. And so all of these red flags, I'm thinking, no bueno. We've probably got some malware that we need to be concerned about. But it's important to recognize that when you do any investigation, you're going to have to kind of go through some rabbit holes, and you're always going to be researching more than the takeaways you get. And so in this case, I looked through external threats to see those crawls. But you can also find this in passive total host pairs. It turns out that those 10 that I was looking at are actually all for sale, which is good news, especially if you are a company that wants to do proactive or defensive domain purchases. So that's actually great to know. But when I looked through that, it quickly became clear, oh, these are not at present spewing malware. They're actually for sale. And that was just a thing that I had to kind of keep digging till I found it. But wanted to call out, everyone is going to go through rabbit holes as you do these investigations, and that really is part of it, because you might find gems like this. I initially was disappointed and thought, oh bummer, it actually is not some something salacious to report, but this is actually really beneficial for clients to know when things are for sale, because that might be a purchase they want to make. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking at the 11 that we tied to the IP address that we researched in Passive Total, I started to look at what was common between all 11. And all 11 were privacy redacted, their who is information not there. And a handful showed a previous resolution to a third common IP. So that again supports our theory that this was likely part of a connected campaign, that they've been moved in bulk between different pieces of infrastructure. And then that third IP is now something that I can follow up as a new lead for additional research. Next slide, please. Okay, so I titled this one, Don't Overlook the Obvious, because although the 11 that I just pointed out all had privacy redacted who is information, it turns out domain X had real info in the who is registration. And although that is becoming increasingly less common, it still does happen. So definitely take advantage of the selectors and the biodata you find there. Like Benjamin mentioned, even if it is privacy redacted, sometimes those phone numbers or addresses will give you leads. In this case, we had a name, email address, phone, and address. And so what I wanted to do is take the same tactic that I took on the infrastructure, but then look at the people route, because you can change infrastructure just like you can change a phone number. But if we kind of get all of those pieces and we're monitoring for all of those, we're a little bit more likely to see the campaigns and the commonalities as they evolve. So I stayed within PT. I think it's really important when you are trying to investigate and exploit the information in a tool to kind of finish out and pull all the information you can in that tool before you move on, because this is the sort of thing that you branch off into a million different threads. And if you set any of this aside and you come back tomorrow, your brain will hurt. You won't remember where you left off. So I actually searched Mr. Kim here in Passive Total. There's in the search bar, you can just search for who is name. And I just searched for that directly. Turns out this individual is tied to thousands, I think about 8,000 different domains. And obviously you don't need to go through all 8,000, but if you start clicking around, it quickly became apparent that there was another email address and another physical address that were used interchangeably with the ones we saw at the top. Next slide. So before we get too deep in the weeds, I do also want to preface, because I'm sure some people are thinking, is it really worth it to go through all this extra trouble? And I want to say that it really depends on the question and the challenge that you're trying to solve. If you are a company that has on-off here or there domain infringement, perhaps you don't need to go this extra step. But if you feel like you're actually being targeted by a threat actor and you really are trying to get a grip and a handle on this stuff and be proactive, then it may actually be worth your time to go through. I'll also add that if you have third-party data sets or tools, of course, you can kind of breeze through this research potentially faster, but if we go through the rest of this, I'm really focusing on things that everyone can do, and that is a lot of Google. You can get quite a bit of information and extrapolate from what you can find just out on the open web. So I'll preface with that and just add that if you want to do additional digging on your own, or if what we go through today is not enough, there's always another level. But we're just going to go through a few things here to show you how you can continue to collect additional selectors that might be used in these registrations to track over time. Okay, so the first thing that stood out to me here was that first email address, domainco@neighbor.com. Folks actually want to Google this themselves. Neighbor.com was not familiar to me, so I needed to look that up. And initially I thought, ooh, interesting. I wonder if this is like a corporate email address that perhaps this individual is tied to. So I did a little bit of research on Neighbor and quickly found this is actually a South Korean platform. It has its own search engine and it offers the ability to create email addresses, much like Google or Gmail. So that one probably not super helpful. Next, I wanted to look at that phone number. And before I did a ton of digging to see if it was tied to anyone else out there, I wanted to know if this was a mobile that someone would actually carry around with them, or if this was a landline or a VoIP. So if folks want to actually visit that Wikipedia link, I'm going to pop that back in the chat so you can pull that up. Take a quick peek in there and let us know if you think that this is a mobile, landline, or a VoIP phone. I already did the legwork to look at the country code. It is a South Korean phone. But if you want to dig through there, you'll be able to kind of parse that out. This is something that most countries have a numbering scheme for phones. So if you do want to get this detailed, a lot of this information is out there. You just need to identify the country code first, which is usually the first 1 or 2 numbers. And then the next chunks of numbers can tell you different things. So this is where I started here. If anybody comes up with the answer, feel free to put it in the chat. Barrett, have we gotten any answers there?
Jordan, none yet.
Okay. All right, well, I will give you guys the short version, which is it is a VoIP phone. And this is helpful to know because it means this person can ditch this phone at any time and that we might need to look for additional numbers in the future. It may also mean that the person has other phones now that we can find. The next thing I did is look at this address that was included in the domain X, who is registration info. So I put this in Google Maps, and sadly, it did not come down to a particular location. It gave me a street, which is something, but not a ton else I can do there except add this address to my list and keep an eye out for it in the future. Next slide, please.
Give me 1 second. Okay.
Sure. Okay, I also looked at that second address that we found through some of the other WHOIS registrations for Mr. Kim, and this was in Victoria, British Columbia. So I gave this a Google, and if you're following along at home, I encourage you to do the same. And particularly look to see if you can find anything on this address on real estate websites. I'm talking detailed anything, photos specifically. On Google, I was only able to find the street view. There's really nothing there for aerial. And it stood out to me very quickly. This is a residential address. It's got a call box, a camera, and a large security gate. And you probably can't even see it. The house seems so set back that you can't really make it out from the street. So that's interesting to me, and it suggests that the person here is possibly pretty security conscious. But also when I gave this address a Google, I found it tied to Mr. Kim. You can see in the screenshot I took here on a website called Locate Family. This is interesting because it starts to suggest that Mr. Kim might actually be a real person, maybe not a fake name. This Locate Family link also included a Canadian landline. It's this number here, 125, that's how it starts. And of course, when I searched that, I found yet another link. And I'm actually gonna pull it up to show you because it's a little bit buried in there. So let me take this back from you.
Okay, so you want me to make you presenter real quick?
Please, that'd be great.
Okay, 1 second. Okay.
Okay, can everyone see my screen here?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so I mentioned this in the slide, but when you're searching phone numbers, search different variants of them. And it turns out when I dropped the country code, second hit was this one called Import Genius. And I didn't really know what to make of this at first. And we've already talked about rabbit holes. You always need to kind of be aware not to let yourself go too far, but sometimes you do kind of have to dig around a little bit. And so I started skimming some of this information. You know, I'm seeing importing info. All right, none of this seems super relevant to me. And even as you go down, a lot of details, doesn't seem super relevant. But if you click over to this company tab, all of a sudden we have a supplier and an importer. First thing that stood out to me is a new address in Victoria, which is where the second address we searched was also located. And it's registered to Mr. Kim with, what do you know, the Canadian landline we just searched. So that's where this was hitting in Google. And then over here for Goy Media, this other company, we see a new address, but it's in the same district and city as what we found in Whois. So that's interesting. But then of course, this VoIP number that we searched at the beginning is also here. So we can be kind of confident that Mr. Kim is likely tied to both sides here, the supplier side, Goy Media, and the importer side, Magic Flowers Gifts. So we can go back to the slides now. I just wanted to show you that because sometimes it does kind of get lost in web pages, and I know I'm one to kind of give up when I don't see something early, but it does kind of behoove us to take our time and look through these.
Give me a quick second.
Yep, of course.
Okay, that's amazing. That's like the coolest thing. It's like it links everything together with your full investigation.
Yeah. So if you hit the next slide, here I've got consolidated all of the info that we can now tie to Mr. Kim. And this is important because you want to have a master list as you look through domain infringement candidates, so that you're not missing things. Because if I had just searched on domain co in Passive Total, I would not have pulled back all of the other domains tied to Mr. Kim. And turns out I searched the companies that we just found, and Goy Media is actually tied to thousands of additional domains in Passive Total that I hadn't seen prior. So again, when you are tracking something that you think is a real problem, a large scale campaign, and you're trying to kind of wrap your head around it, it does behoove you to go the extra mile and look both at the infrastructure and the people side. Any questions on that?
So I have a quick question, Jordan. So when you have a telephone number and it's in a foreign country, are these Wikipedia things set up for all the countries, or it's hit and miss?
There's good odds that they will be there. I will just say that not every country follows a logical numbering scheme. Okay. So you do have to just kind of search it and see what's out there. There will be times when you cannot find from open source what sort of phone number this is, but many countries do have really logical numbering schemes. And so it's always just, it's worth a quick search just to see if something's out there. It doesn't take too much time, and it's free info.
Very cool. You didn't call any of the numbers, did you?
I did not. No, I did not. You're welcome to try, though.
No.
So with that, I'll turn it back over and just add one additional point, which is this is the same sort of lens that we meaning i3 bring to any of the investigations we're doing, whether this is a domain infringement or a threat attribution to an executive in your company. Following these sort of steps and checking our assumptions is really key to the products we produce. So I'll turn that back over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you. And
Jordan, really, sorry,
yeah.
Jump in, Benjamin. Jordan, really quickly, we had a question about what site did you use to find that address again?
The most recent one, the Import Genius one?
Yeah, the home address and that we were looking at in for Mr. Kim with the
family
screenshot
member,
of the gate. Yeah.
Look up.
Got it. It was locate family, and you can find it. At least I think this is what we're talking about. I'm sorry if I have this totally wrong.
Yeah.
If you search the address I just put in the chat, this one we pulled from Passive Total, and then we just gave it a Google to see, one, is this a real place? Is this a residential home? And then can we find any additional context around it? And then when I Googled that address, there is a link that will come up on Google that is called Locate Family. And that ties in open source, not just in Whois registrations, Mr. Kim with that address, as well as a Canadian landline.
Got it. Perfect. Thanks.
Sure.
Jordan, this is the type of thing that as we're SOC analysts and doing investigations, we generally don't go into the attribution phase, and it's hard. But it's so nice to see somebody that knows how this works and what needs to happen to really piece the investigation from the virtual computer realm into the real world. And it's amazing to see how you tied this to a physical address and to a person, and brought the full loop of the investigation to an attribution to say, no, this is the person, this is where they are, this is their address and telephone. That's incredible.
Thanks. It's fun being a little bit of an online stalker.
but this is the piece that most of us don't get to see, and this is why it was so important to have you and Josh come and talk to us today, because we generally, once we find the infrastructure, we block it, we do something, we turn it over to legal, and we're done. But now, taking this to another aspect, if somebody needed to use services from i3, how does that work? And is it per, how is it? I know that can you explain like what the tokens are that i3 uses for investigations and kind of a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So in addition to managing some of the products I mentioned, like external threats or Executive Guardian, we do also offer a service called Advanced Investigations, and it is a subscription that gives you access to a senior analyst on our team. It counts for a handful of hours, and so most clients will get several tokens a month that they can essentially leverage us for any additional investigations on a threat actor that has maybe taken an action against someone at their company or done something online that they want a little bit more help with. We can also do things like sentiment analysis, geofencing, giving an overview of new threats in that industry. So all those sorts of things. It really is a boutique custom service, and we work to make sure that every month those clients are getting something that's beneficial and useful to them. We don't hope that an incident happens or a breach happens that they need us, but it does give them access to us should they request any of that additional information.
And you can do threat assessments as well for an organization or an individual as well, correct?
Yep, absolutely.
So a lot of people don't know when they really need a service like i3, but let's say that you're a startup and you're coming up with the new coolest thing. If somebody steals that information or that idea, your business is done. So it's never too soon to get involved with somebody like i3 to help you figure out what you have, how to protect it and safeguard it for the longevity of your organization and your executives. So that's why I wanted i3 to come and show what they do, because they do this day after day, every day, and get to the attribution phase. You know, like for what I do and what I show, we never get to the attribution phase. We get to, here's the infrastructure and we're done. So I wanted you to see that the investigation really isn't over at that point. You really need a seasoned professional that's done this for their living to show how to do those attributions and to tie it to the physical reality of where these threat actors are and what they're doing and what's their motivation behind it. What are they trying to do? It's amazing. And you're welcome back, Jordan and Josh, anytime to show us some of these skills and show us some of these investigations, because it's fascinating. It's like, to me, it's like watching a movie, an adventure movie. It's really cool. It's the reality of what we all strive to become in our industry. You're doing it every day. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Barrett, were there any questions that came up for takedowns?
We do have a question for Jordan. She was talking about going down rabbit holes. We had multiple questions come in asking, how do you determine where to draw that line? And, when do you stop? How far is too far?
Well, that's a great question. I think you really need to understand the question you're trying to answer. And then as you continue to research focus yourself back on that and ask, is this helping me get towards answering that question? It might be interesting info, but if it's not helping you answer the question, perhaps you need to set it aside, come back to it, out of your own time when you have time to be curious. But really focusing on what you're trying to do. In this case, we were trying to, one, is this domain something we need to be concerned about, and is it a targeted campaign? And so throughout that process, we were able to use passive total, say yes it is, and then yes it is. This is likely a targeted campaign. And then in order for your organization to be proactive about that and connect additional pieces to it, that's where you just need to amass all the different selectors to make sure that you're not missing things. So I could have very well gone down a whole other angle with investigating Mr. Kim. Of course, we could look for social media. We could research this person 10 ways to Sunday. But if it's not helping me answer the question, then it might be worth setting aside for a future time. But of course, document everything you do. I think anytime you are researching anything in any capacity, document it, even in your own internal notes, because so much of this work is iterative. It's iterative research. You find something, you make note of it, and then you might need to research it in a different way, or like I mentioned with phone numbers, searching variants. So make sure that anything you do, you just make a note to yourself that I searched it in this platform in this way, so that in the future, if you do need to come back to that to break off in a different tangent, you know where you've left it and you know what information you already have. So that's a long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I do it.
Jordan, I have another question. So like for a client, if you were going to be doing this report for them, once this report is generated, what are the steps that you do when you present the report, or the findings, or the documentation that you give them?
Yeah, so we would write really all of our findings up here. We want everything that we give a client to be really actionable and not force them to read 20 pages just to understand what we're saying. So we try and keep this short, sweet, but thorough, to show here are all the things that we did, and here's what you don't need to worry about because we took care of it. Okay. And so for this particular client, for domain X, we documented all of the same steps that we showed today, and then gave them an assessment at the top of what we thought was happening, as well as a paragraph called avenues for further investigation. So if they had questions, or if they wanted more, here are some suggested angles that we could take this. So anything we do, as I mentioned, you can keep researching your heart out. So we include some of the places that we think might have the most interesting info, and then say, if you need to take this further, here's something that we could do for you, or you could even look at on your own if you'd like.
So have any of these investigations turned into, turn them over, the client goes, hey, we want you to talk to law enforcement?
That hasn't happened to my knowledge, but takedowns certainly. Okay. And Josh, perhaps you can speak more to law enforcement angle. I'm not sure if that has come up too much on your side.
Once you get respective law enforcement involved, usually it's going to be something that takes quite a while to do anything on. I mean, the higher level you get, if you're working with registrar, it's usually a registrant. A lot of times it's quick because they just want it out of their name. Once you get to the registrar, it can be anything, 24, 48 hours, 72 hours, within days is what you're looking at. Once you start going on those higher levels, though, as soon as you turn it to DRP, anything like that, you can stretch that into weeks. And if they press back or fight to say, oh no, I have a legitimate use for this, you can't take this away from me, then it can become a lengthy battle that can last into months. But usually, I would say, from my personal experience, when you're working on these, if you have anything that is legitimately infringing, you can expect it down within a week.
Okay. And it's blocked on the blacklist immediately, so then you have protection for people not visiting, but it might physically be up for a period of time until it's taken down. Okay.
Hey, Josh, related to what you were just talking about and timelines for the takedown process, which was great because someone was just asking about how long it takes. But what's the best approach to accelerate takedowns?
I mean, really, you got to gauge based on what the content is itself. If it's a typo squat domain that's email capable, it's a lot harder to. The hosting provider is not going to care. The registrar might care, but they're going to push back because they're going to say, well, we don't see anything. We won't see email headers. We want to see evidence that it's being used maliciously. So it's really dependent on the situation. Most of the time for me, I've always found that the registrar is the best way to go with anything maliciously registered, though. If you're trying to get it down quick, just reach out to them, give them all the details you can, all the stuff that Jordan was relaying. If you have stuff like that that you can lay out to them, they're going to take action. I mean, unless you just get one that, as we call it, are hacker friendly, because you do come across registrars across the world that they legitimately don't really care what we're setting. And that's where DRB gets involved, where we can try to get pressure on them to work with us.
Got it. Cool. Thanks, Josh. I think we have time for another question here. Jordan, talking a little bit about the i3 and the expertise, other expertise that the team has, but I've got a question about, can you give us a couple examples of RiskIQ products where i3 lends its expertise?
Sure, yeah. So in addition to research like domain infringement or threat attribution, which we've just talked about, i3 can also do additional research and investigation for our clients. I'll just name a couple. For Executive Guardian, we do a fully analyst-driven product called Risk and Vulnerability Reports, where we scour the internet for an executive's presence to determine both their cyber and their physical vulnerabilities. And we're looking for things that are both out there that could be exploited, as well as things that are out there that could cause a threat actor to want to exploit them. And we package that up in a way that is not meant as a scare tactic, but very much a snapshot in time. It's an awareness tool to show here's what's out there and here's the connections that someone could make if they had malintent. So that's one thing. We also leverage our expertise to augment digital footprint, and for our clients using digital footprint to track their own infrastructure, internet-facing infrastructure. We can kind of contextualize the threat environment for that client, both in terms of their industry as well as this day and age. What's going on in 2020 and some of the cyber threats today are very different than the end of 2019 with the rise of COVID. So we can really place a lot of that stuff in context. But we also add in a human element by looking at a company's exposures in terms of emails on deep and dark web. We can also look for any sort of clues, like we just mentioned that someone might have registered company infrastructure with personal names or personal email addresses, and then show a company, here's why this person could be compromised. Here are some of the ways that a threat actor, if motivated, could take advantage of that situation. So those are just two examples, but like I mentioned, i3 is really geared to be an extension of our client security teams, and so we aim to please however the client needs us.
You can either augment or replace or fill in the gaps to extend the capabilities of the teams that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Well, that's all the time we have questions for today. We'll follow up directly with those of you who asked questions we weren't able to ask live. If you do have any other questions, you can always reach out to success@riskiq.net with more questions. Thank you to Jordan, Josh, and Benjamin for a great workshop. Finally, thank you to all of you for attending, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.